So it's about 10:25 and nobody has signed in for the class. And so I just thought that I would record a quick lesson on the square and square just for those who want to kind of refer back to it or anything. So I'm just going to sit here and talk to myself for a few minutes. Let's see how this goes. All right. So what I taught on Tuesday was I taught how to do your squares using a square ruler. You don't have to use this ruler. You can use just a regular ruler. This one just happens to be really handy to use because the markings are very clear and defined. And so if you use this ruler, you have to follow the instructions for the Deb Tucker ruler cutouts, which said that you needed to cut one background block that was 2 5/8, I believe, by 2 5/8. And then you needed to cut out 2 of the background squares for each one of the primary color squares. So it ended up being like 400 squares that you had to 200 or 400 squares. And so you cut these the same size, the foreground color and the background color the same size. And then once you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to diagonally cut right here. And I'm not showing the camera, Emma. I need to share the camera. Hang on. Okay. So here we go. So now you can see the little squares that I cut, which are 2 5/8. Sorry, 2 5/8 inch square. For every square in a square, you're going to cut 2 background squares and 1 foreground square. And you need a bunch of them for this border. It's going to look really nice when you're done, but you need a whole bunch of them. Once you do that, you're going to take your background squares and you're going to cut them in half diagonally. That's going to give you 4 triangles per foreground square. All right, once you have those, then you're going to stitch a background square onto your foreground squares. And so you lay your triangle on, and I'll lay a second triangle on here because I already sewed that one. You're going to lay your triangle on here, and you're just going to try to center it fairly well in that square. And you can look at it better on the back where you see that these 2 little side triangles are about the same size. You don't have to worry about getting it exact because you're going to trim it down after you sew it. So I've already sewed this one, and now I'm going to press it back. And then I'm going to take and lay one out on the opposite side. So you always sew opposite sides. And I'm going to kind of center it on there. Okay, that looks pretty good. My little triangles are about the same size. And then I'm going to come over and I'm going to do my 1/4 inch seam. And machine's not threaded. So I'm going to pause recording for a minute while I thread my machine. So sorry about that. I went and threaded my machine and I stitched my little 1/4 inch seam. And so what I have now is I have a block that looks like this. The triangles are sewn on the opposite sides. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my triangle on the other 2 sides. So again, I'm going to line it up and just center it visually. You know, it doesn't have to be exact. And then I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. And your 1/4 inch seam needs to be pretty exact. But the actual centering of it doesn't, because you're going to trim it down straight. Okay, so I sewed that one on. Oops, cut the thread. So I sewed that one on. And here we go. Now I'm going to put my 4th triangle on there. Again, centering it as visually as best as I can, getting it fairly close. And I'm going to sew my 4th triangle on there. And then I'm just going to finger press that out. So now I have my square and a square, and I also have all of these little dog ears sticking out and everything else. And so now I'm going to trim that square. I'm going to use the Tucker ruler, And I'll show you this Tucker ruler real quick. All right, so this side of the ruler is where you decide what size that square is. And so this is how you decide what size your center square is, and then that will tell you what size your outside squares are. And so you do the center square for a 3-inch block, which is what we want to end up with, is this line here. So you would cut those squares to that line. I measured that block as 2 5/8 inch, and that's when I gave the AccuQuilt die to cut those squares, because I'm not going to sit there and cut 400 and some little squares by myself. And so that's what that side of the die is for. This other of the die of the ruler is for. The other side of the ruler, which is this one, is the one that you're really going to be working with, because this is going to be where you cut your square and square out and you trim it. And if you use these markings on this ruler, it's going to give you a really exact center of your square is going to be centered in the outer square. There are 2 markings. There's dashed line markings and there's straight line markings. You use the dashed markings first, and you're going to line up your center block to the 4 X's on the dotted line block. And if you see here, I'm looking for my 4 3s because that's the 3-inch square that I want to finish with. And so if I put my fabric under there, okay, then I'm going to line up that top square, I'm going to line up the bottom square, and I'm going to line up the 2 side X's. And once I have that lined up well, I'm just going to trim one side and the second side. Okay. Now, once I have those 2 sides squared up, I'm going to turn my square 180 degrees, and I'm going to again line up that square and square, and I'm going to line up my edges this time against that square. So I'm going to line up to make it a 3.5-inch square because it finishes to 3. I'm going to line up those lines, and I'm going to use those solid lines on that square. And then I'm going to trim my last 2 sides. And what you see here there is now a trimmed 3.5-inch square and square block that when you sew it has the perfect 1/4 inch that you need, so you don't cut off that point, a 1/4 inch here so you don't cut off that point, a 1/4 inch here, and a 1/4 inch here. And so you should have no problem then sewing these all together once you get them done. Pay attention to what order they go in. The borders on this pattern are kind of interesting because the square and squares are sewn together. Let me stop that share and share with you the actual pattern. Okay, I'm going to share the picture of you of what it looks like when you're going to be putting it all together. Okay. And that is this page right here. And so let me annotate this. Do it in a little bit thicker of a line. Okay, because I want you to see is that in the center here, wrong color to do this in. Let me change my color. Let me see, how do I change my color? Format, there we go. Change it to pink. Okay, so now I can redraw this. Well, you see this in pink right here. This center G square is a blank square. And that's so when you measure, after you sew on your little gray border right there, then you're going to sew this border on. If you need to adjust it, you do not want to cut off your points on this square because that's really going to be noticeable. And so if you need to adjust it a little bit to get that to fit exactly where it needs to be right there, this is where you would adjust your seams. And so you can take that border in on either side of that so that that is where it might be a little bit shy of a 3-inch square when it's done, but you're not going to notice that. If you cut your points off here or here, you're really going to notice that. So when you put your borders together, Okay, then measure the sides of your quilt and cut your borders to the size of your quilts. Don't go by the pattern size. You need to really measure what yours are to get it fairly simple. And your sides, this border on this side should equal the same size as this border on this side. If it's a little bit off, if it's up to like a half an inch off, don't worry about it. It's not going to see anything. It's not going to look different. But if you're more than half an inch off, it's really going to show on how square that quilt lies. And so you really want to try to square up that quilt. So you would then go back into your main section where you sewed these 9 big blocks together and go, where can I take up a little bit or let out a little bit where it's not really going to be noticeable so that I can get my quilt squared within that space, because you really want your top and your bottom to match in size and you want your sides to match in size. There's numerous different techniques on how to do that, but with this quilt you really need to watch where you're cutting off points or where you're going to make things look awkward if you just chop randomly. So really pay attention to that, because you've got this beautiful quilt. You don't want to get to the end of putting the borders on it and then find out that it really doesn't look right because it's skewed one way or the other. And so those are the things to pay attention to in your borders. You got a 2.5 inch border here, which is your inner border. Then you have the square and square border. And then you have another 2.5 inch border. And then you have the final 3.5 inch border. And those are your 3 borders. And once you get done with that, you are done with your quilt. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thanks.